First, I want to begin by thanking the Chancellor for inviting me to be the first occupant of the University Chair of Liberal Studies. For far too long, this institution has been a hotbed of neoconservatism and libertarian ideology, and it's past time to restore the balance. If we want to talk about that later, I'll be happy to. Second, I want to apologize to any students here who are maybe under duress in this room. Again, having selected CROSMAN lecturers before and worried about whether or not anybody would show up, I have not been above encouraging faculty and students to be certain that there was attendance. So I just hope it's worth it for you. We have given you copies of outline of the talk, which may be useful. It's as they say in cultural anthropology, a somewhat thick description today, and it may be useful to follow along with the outline. Before beginning, I would like to ask you to indulge me in a couple of personal reflections that bear a little bit on what Chris just said. As you know, I have been leading a double life. I've often said, and only partially facetiously, that I'm just a fuzzy-headed academic masquerading as a public broadcaster. Alternatively, when I'm back in this environment, I might be accused of being a academic poseur, a media technician with a patina of theory. The reality is that I have been fortunate to have had the opportunity to explore both domains in depth. But of course, many friends have been puzzled by these migrations over the course of a career, from the academy to public broadcasting, back to the academy for a long time, and then back again to public media for a good stint. And the first very understandable question in that regard is, why in heaven's name, and particularly this last time, would you have given up a tenured full professorship in a Carnegie I research institution? The answer to that, of course, is going back into public broadcasting has been a terrific experience at the crossover between communication studies and applied media, permitting me the opportunity to explore the classic Western tradition of interplay between theory and praxis. I've been privileged to have been a participant observer, if you will, to work in the intersections of thought about social order, culture, technology, and politics, and to make applied efforts to contribute to the often messy business of building community and civic discourse. The second frequent question of me has been about the differences between presidential duties at a public television station and the decanal responsibilities at a university. The answer to that one is that both jobs are inherently more similar than one might imagine. Alas, they both involve far too much fundraising, the curse of modern nonprofit administration and higher education administration as well. But seriously, at their core, both jobs are dedicated to education, reflecting an important commonality across the divide between town and gown. The campus side is somewhat more narrowly focused among a relatively small circle of faculty and defined cohorts of students, and it is dedicated to the expansion of particular domains of knowledge and related habits of intellectual and media practice. The other job is more broad-ranging in the community at large and in the application of those skills to the cultivation of public debate about social and political affairs directly among tens and even hundreds of thousands of citizens. But regardless of those similarities and differences, my great privilege has been to work in the two institutions, to interpolate back and forth between them, and to try, however imperfectly, to provide a modicum of leadership to each. So it is in that context, indeed, a very great honor to be back before you and to reflect a bit on the most recent of these two experiences. And also to say, to second what Chris was saying about Ralph CROSMAN, it may not be apparent from that chronology, but he was a very lonely figure for a long time in the 20s and 30s and into the 40s. Gail Waldrop finally joined him, and then they began to build a faculty. I had the privilege of knowing Gail, who served for a long time as Ralph's successor as director of the school, and he told me often about the difficulties of sustaining the concept of journalism education at a time when it was still outre and very much down market and green eye shade and just not well understood and appreciated well in the academy at large. So it is more than an honor, than you know, to be here in his shadow. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is to pull together a number of insights about the institution of U.S. public broadcasting and the challenges that it continues to face both externally and internally. These thoughts build on more summary remarks I made at the recent National Conference on Media Reform in Denver a couple of weeks ago, and on a panel here at CU just a year ago. I've drawn the title, "A Public Trust in Jeopardy," from a particular rhetorical celebration that has been regularly deployed by public broadcasting leadership in recent years, but that also stretches back over a generation to one of the most comprehensive and visionary semi-official planning documents for U.S. public media. The document in question is the second Carnegie Commission report in 1979, which was entitled "A Public Trust, the Landmark Report of the Carnegie Commission on the Future of Public Broadcasting." Now, the second half of that title was not of the Commission's choosing. That hyperbole was imposed by the Carnegie Foundation's PR staff. It's just a bit presumptuous, I think, to claim landmark status for a study before it's even been published, let alone read and reviewed. Nonetheless, with that disclaimer made, the important part for our purposes is the first half, a public trust. The Commission itself chose that title for at least two reasons. First, it argued that in a relatively short time, only 12 years since the first Carnegie report in the Public Broadcasting Act in 1967, public broadcasting had managed to establish itself as a national treasure. It had, the report said, come into its own and was now firmly embedded in the national consciousness. The report argued that through a rich array of programming, the institution had clearly set itself apart from commercial broadcasting, thereby readily justifying the federal tax dollars that had begun to flow to it. So this is the late 70s we're talking about. Secondly, however, the second Carnegie report was not at all dewy-eyed about the difficulties facing the enterprise. It identified a number of major organizational and process flaws in the new system, and it called for a major restructuring, particularly at the national level. In a bold and heretical move, it recommended the replacement of the still then young Corporation for Public Broadcasting by two new entities, one to be named the Program Services Endowment and the other the Public Telecommunications Trust. Hence a dual meaning for the word trust, an emerging, highly laudatory brand for public media as a widely admired institution meriting even greater public support, plus a new structural arrangement embedding the word trust in its very name. We don't have time to delve into the details of the full report. As an aside, however, I do commend it to you for later consideration. Despite all the changes in technology and media in the decades since, the problems outlined by the report still ring true, and the public has not been well served by the failure of successive Congresses, White Houses, FCCs, and by the public media themselves to take seriously the report's critique and their failure to have attempted to implement any of its key provisions. This is going to get me in real trouble. The other aspect of the public trust imagery that I'm invoking is the more recent set of claims by public media themselves, centered around a series of annual national opinion surveys which have repeatedly reported that the public credits PBS as the most trusted institution in the United States, and further, that public broadcasting is one of the top two best investments of federal dollars made by the government. You've frequently heard these claims and survey results as they've become a staple in the marketing by PBS, CPB, and countless stations, including channels 12 and 6 here in Colorado. And why not? These are wonderful testimonials that are manna to an otherwise frequently beleaguered enterprise. Yet all that positive imagery belies a seriously inconvenient and unexplained truth, namely that despite all those plaudits, as well as countless major national and local programming awards, much of public broadcasting remains profoundly under-resourced, marginalized, and struggling to find its way. How is it then that the public can so revere an institution and yet fail to support it adequately? So my further purpose this evening is to try to answer that question by highlighting a series of external constraints in federal communications policy, along with a few parallel internal issues in the structure and processes of public media themselves. In the end, I will suggest a few changes that might help public media better capitalize on the public's trust, to help it earn a better base of material support, and to find a more stable place for itself in the heart of American life. And at the moment, I am now going to have a Marco Rubio moment.
At least you knew where it was.
Yeah. Right. There are many challenges to public broadcasting that we could spend several sessions reviewing. And we could really go on for a long time. Let me focus now on just 5, which you have, you'll see in, under Section B in the outline. To begin with the question of communications policy prior to the Public Broadcasting Act of '67. The key defining characteristic of U.S. broadcasting is that by comparison with most other industrial democracies, it began in the 1920s and 30s as a privately held commercial enterprise. Elsewhere, broadcasting was understood first and foremost as a cultural institution. It was seen as an extension of language, theater, and the arts, with a mission to help and build and sustain national identity. So it was initially chartered to public service entities. By contrast, U.S. broadcasting was seen from the beginning as a creature of commerce, to serve principally as an advertising medium and to treat audiences as markets to be delivered to industrial clients. In that form, broadcasting success was measured not around indices of quality, but almost entirely by questions of popularity. That is, by audience size and ratings, and it was given over almost entirely to private enterprise. In the wake of World War I, there were several important guiding social and cultural conditions that shaped radio. There were the eroding cultural constraints of the Victorian era. There was resistance to a prior generation of new federal regulation of economic and industrial practices. And there was virulent anti-European jingoism. As a result, U.S. politics and social outlook were intensely isolationist, self-absorbed, and self-congratulatory. As Frederick Lewis Allen once put it so well, the 1920s were a period of ballyhoo business boosterism, and the American government was rededicating the country to core elements of corporate capitalism and the primacy of private ownership of all means of production, including culture. In that context, it seemed natural to place the new radio technology in the private sector and to fuel it with advertising dollars from the rapidly growing post-war consumer industries. Because it could not police itself relative to frequency assignments and operating rules, the industry itself called for federal regulation, and it even welcomed a fiduciary licensing standard, the so-called public interest, convenience, and necessity. But it was fully understood by the industry and the federal policy establishment that this was to be a very light touch standard indeed, to be focused mostly on technical issues and not, as many had supposed, on matters of programming content and quality. Even before being incorporated into the Radio Act of '27 and the Communications Act of 1934, the public interest standard had been fully compromised in various state and other federal regulatory regimes, particularly in transportation and banking. But there was very little public, press, or even academic awareness of those contradictions, and I would dare say that same confusion persists to this day. Given such widespread misunderstanding about the workings of the fiduciary principle and totally at odds with the experience in other countries, the 27 and 34 laws made no provisions whatsoever for public service broadcasting. In the American zeitgeist, it was widely assumed that as overseen by the FCC, the public interest standard would help guide a wealthy private broadcasting enterprise to provide all the necessary social benefits of radio and television. In that light, there was little case, it seemed, for an alternative non-commercial broadcasting system. As a result, it was many decades later and only in the midst of the social turmoil of the 1960s and wide critiques of commercial broadcasting's performance that there was sufficient public policy commitment to the idea of building some sort of more substantive public service media option. With that background, let's move on to the second item on the outline, the structural and process constraints that were re-embedded in the new law. So the question is, what happened when in 1967 the first Carnegie report was published and there was the near instantaneous passage that year of the Public Broadcasting Act? At one level, this appeared to be a major breakthrough. The law created a whole new superstructure at the national level, authorizing the formation of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which in turn led to the chartering of PBS and NPR. And most importantly, it provided for the first time for the infusion of substantial federal funds into the operations and programming developments of what until then had been a relatively weak aggregation of educational radio and television stations. A Johnson-era Great Society program, the new organizations and federal funding for public broadcasting emerged in the aura of the civil rights, environmental, feminist, and consumer movements of the day. And in this age of Aquarius, there was a great deal of optimism about how quickly and fully the public broadcasting system might grow. It was not uncommon to hear that finally, in the US, finally, we were building our own version of the BBC. But of course, the social and political transformations were not to be nearly as thorough, nor as definitive as many had imagined. This also was the era of the Vietnam War and a series of retrogressive counter-movements. The ink was hardly dry on the Great Society legislation when various conservative and libertarian agendas were put into place with the explicit goal of unpacking many of them and important pieces of the New Deal too. Meanwhile, the very concept of federal funding for public broadcasting had already become seriously contentious. As a result, one of the major flaws of the 1967 Act was that it provided for no permanent source for federal funding. Nothing like the license fees abroad, no spectrum use fee, no tax on the sale of TV receivers or on the proceeds of commercial broadcasting, nothing. Despite considerable knowledgeable commentary at the time noting that without such protected forms of funding, public broadcasting's independence would be seriously compromised, the issue was avoided. Instead, federal funding was and has remained embedded in the annual congressional authorization and appropriation process, just like any other government agency. As such, it regularly has been vulnerable to too much political oversight and therefore made the subject of considerable discord. Almost every year there have been large, exhausting fights over the funding question, sapping the energies of the system generally and diverting the leadership from their other responsibilities of building the enterprise and improving its programming and services. Another major consequence of those fights and the lack of any guarantees is that the amounts have been kept low and in check. You've heard the figures. We tax ourselves less than $500 million a year to support public television and radio, meaning that while the national treasury support for public broadcasting in all other nations ranges roughly from $30 to $85 per capita, that is per citizen, the amount in the US is less than $1.50. Moreover, there has been no sustained increase toward the levels originally imagined by the two Carnegie reports. The initial federal appropriations for CPB and other programs began to take hold as expected in the late 1960s, and by 1971 they were approaching $70 million. But already in the following 2 years, there was a round of Nixon administration cuts amounting to 18%. After Watergate, the atmosphere was somewhat more supportive and the federal monies began to grow again, but now from a much lower base than had been contemplated at the outset. That pattern was to be repeated in the early 1980s, when after a period of renewed growth to almost $200 million, there were hard Reagan-era cuts of another 17%. That reality undermined key aspects of the second Carnegie report recommendations, which had imagined nearly $600 million in federal support by the mid-1980s. So we were just barely getting to $200 million at a time when it was expected we were supposed to be 3 times that much, and already that $200 million was being cut by 17%. Again, there was some recovery during the next decade, and by the mid-1990s, the levels were over $300 million. But at that point, under the threat of Newt Gingrich's Contract for America, there was another round of major reductions, this time by nearly 30%. And in the past few years, it's been happening yet again, where after recovering and peaking at over $500 million in 2010, we've seen a series of reductions that now amount to nearly 15%. Altogether, then, we're seeing a phenomenon here that I no longer think is accidental, and that I'm calling Rowland's first law of public media policy. That is, there are now a permanent set of 10 to 15-year federal funding cycles for public broadcasting, in which, after a period of slow, steady annual increases, like this, significant cuts are made, after which it takes another 4 or 5 years to regain the lost ground and then keep growing. But then another cut is made. And you keep going like this. And you see what happens to that curve. It flattens out over time. This is called a sawtooth pattern. And the codicil to the law is that the newer numbers will never be anywhere near as large as originally projected in the curve that should have gone up from 1967 in the early 70s at a steady increasing rate against the mission goals set out by the 2 Carnegie Commission's report. We could borrow from our late friend and World Affairs Conference stalwart Roger Ebert and say that what we've had for public broadcasting over the years is a regular federal pattern of funding interruptus. And to reiterate the dual effects of that process, not only does it seriously depress the rate of funding increases upon which the system's founding was premised, it also keeps the public broadcasting leadership seriously distracted from planning for growth and development. There also are 2 additional effects at the local level, which I have felt a great deal myself. It drives local stations into incessant fundraising appeals, and it forces them to seek more corporate support and thereby to be thinking more commercially. Meanwhile, as serious as the funding issues were and are, they are only part of the troublesome legacy from 1967. Another major problem has been the highly complex organizational structure of the system, particularly at the national level. By comparison with any other broadcasting system in the world, public or commercial, American public broadcasting is highly decentralized. In the US, we have 4 major inside the Beltway public broadcasting organizations with national programming responsibilities. 4. Okay? In most other countries, there's 1, maybe 2. Despite its grand name, the CPB is quite limited in its authority. It is largely a federal funding laundering agency, and while it has ways of trying to influence the behavior of the stations, it has none of the operational responsibilities in programming, distribution, and local editorial oversight common to most national broadcasters, public or private. Even PBS is strictly limited in its mandate. Again, unlike any other national broadcaster in the world, including NPR, it is prevented from producing any programming. That right is reserved to a few of its member stations, leading to large inefficiencies and to tremendous confusion about who is in charge relative to national program decisions. So we've got all of these agencies in Washington, probably a dozen or more out across the country, and a whole bunch of redundancy and competitiveness contributing to a confusion and a welter of alphabet soup, and Lord knows why the public doesn't understand it and can't deal with it very well because it is so difficult to explain. A major consequence of all that complexity is a large Rube Goldberg-like process for national program and general policy development. Ask any program producer what it's like to try to seek funding for a program project in PBS, and they'll typically roll their eyes and throw up their hands in exasperation. On top of that, or should I say below it, we have hundreds of local radio and television stations that are fiercely independent of one another and variously suspicious of and in perpetual turmoil about the national entities. They come together in various ways to get some short-term things done, as for instance on the boards of PBS and NPR, or in aggregates of what we call affinity groups. These are associations of various station cohorts, small stations, university stations, large market stations like Channel 6, state network stations, alternative stations such as Channel 12. But these tribal divisions are difficult to manage and to focus on longer-term challenges, as I now know all too well from considerable experience at having led a couple of them. So, ask any rational system planner what it's like to work on major structural or process reforms in public broadcasting, and they'll go screaming away from you, muttering about the difficulties of herding cats. They just can't get their arms around this thing. So let me underscore that point. It's very difficult to organize all the interests and forces for the purposes of system-wide strategic planning. Individual stations such as Channel 12 can do such planning in solid and even sophisticated ways, and individual entities like CPB or PBS can conduct their short-term corporate planning for their own organizations. But there is no authoritative leadership capacity to pull it all together to articulate a common vision and set of plans. As a result, the public television system is mired in a 1970s-like fourth network distribution model. That is, it doesn't have the will, and some would say the imagination, to take advantage of its multiple overlapping local stations to provide a real diversity of services. There is no articulated PBS 1, 2, or 3, as there is with the multiple BBC services plus Channel 4 and the Open University in the UK, or in the multiple networks of the NHK in Japan, CBC English and French language services in Canada, and the ARD and ZDF systems in Germany, France 2, France 3, and we can just go on and on. It's multiple services everywhere except in the US. The stations are very protective of their local control and bottom-up operating system, but they are not always aware of the negative consequences of that privilege. So US public television is frozen in place. It is a hyper-Jeffersonian entity still meeting in Philadelphia, still in the Articles of Confederation period. Here it is, nearly a half-century along, without ever having had the leavening and balancing experiences afforded by completing the Constitutional Convention and the debates about it in the Federalist Papers. Imagine if those things had not happened, what the US would have been like in the year 1800. It wouldn't have existed. Alexander Hamilton and James Madison would be dismayed at what we have left undone in American public broadcasting. So let me turn to the third point. Despite these structural and process constraints, over the years, public broadcasting has been creative in its response to new technology opportunities. This is one of its best aspects. For instance, in the late 1970s, it was among the first broadcast entities to embrace satellite distribution for its national programming. Why was that important? It created all kinds of cost savings and efficiencies for the system, and it also opened up the possibilities of moving signals around much more effectively, which became very necessary in the digital period. Much later, public television did a fine job of managing its transition to digital television, albeit, I quickly add, without adequate federal support. Presently, in the face of the internet, public media are addressing the core challenges facing all broadcasters, namely, to what extent are they to remain in the over-the-air radio frequency business with all its expensive hardware and signal distribution costs? This is a particularly acute question in television. The vast majority of American households receive their television signals via some form of carrier, such as cable, satellite, internet. with only about 15, maybe in some places 20%, still depending solely on household antennas. As more and more younger viewers use only smartphones or tablets as their primary communications devices, and as they rely ever more heavily on social media, television broadcasters are increasingly concerned about the relevance and cost benefits of over-the-air transmission. This challenge is as serious for public television as it is for the commercial world. As a result, public media are closely looking at ways of better engaging the internet. As we've said at Channel 12, the opportunity is to see our website as a medium in and of itself, and to turn it into something much more than a virtual program guide. The question remains, though, at what point does the web supersede the broadcast schedule and even our multicasts as the primary vehicle for serving audiences? At the national level, via PBS Online and Learning Media, for instance, and locally among many stations across the country, one sees creative efforts to exploit online opportunities and to think beyond the legacy broadcast business. But such developments are expensive, and it is a challenge to leverage them on top of the regular broadcasting business that justifies the retention of each station's broadcast frequency and one's highly valuable FCC license. Furthermore, production for the tablets and the PDAs and the interactive ways in which these devices are used often suggest quite different content forms than conventional long-form television. So public broadcasters are faced with the dual challenge and increased cost of having to experiment with new, shorter, and smaller scale media forms, plus all the added elements of multi-platform content while continuing to serve audiences with traditional programming. Further, they have to undertake those adjustments at a time of funding decline or at best stalled growth. I want to look at the fourth issue now. It's very important to understand that the difficulties I am outlining here are not unknown to the policymaking establishment. I really want to underscore that. All of this is understood. Funding shortfalls, being forced out into the commercial marketplace, structural complexity, lack of authoritative leadership, these are all well documented in the literature and in the practical experience of the system. Yet there has been no attempt by any Congress, President, or FCC to address them. To the contrary, there has been an almost studied indifference about the challenges. Worse, at every juncture of major communications policy making in the past 30 years, the government has regularly avoided addressing the issues related to public media. The principal inflection points have been the various stages of telephone broadcasting and cable deregulation of the 1980s and 90s, the digital conversion of the late 90s and the first decade of this century, and now the national broadband plan and proposed spectrum auction. Each of these phases of review has had far-reaching consequences for the character of U.S. telecommunications, including public broadcasting. But in almost none of them has there been any attention to the implications and opportunity for public media. Consider, for instance, the 1996 Telecommunications Act. It is the single most important piece of communications legislation since 1934. It almost totally deregulated commercial radio and other aspects of broadcasting, and it authorized more integration of the old common carrier and newer wireless industries. Its provisions led to such developments as the clear channel radio empire, greater media concentration, cross-ownership between broadcasting and newspaper groups, further restrictions on local government authority to regulate cable television, and the sorts of vertical integrations that have forced consumers, you, to purchase long-term cell phone contracts with every new phone. These are major policy decisions with huge financial and service advantages for large corporate parties. They also could have had important implications for public media if handled correctly. Yet one may search the 1996 law from beginning to end, and you will not find the words public broadcasting mentioned anywhere. And so it is with major initiative after major initiative. There were similar problems with the digital conversion process, and now too with the national broadband plan and spectrum auction. We could go on. Let it suffice here to say that in no other major nation could there be any such sweeping national communications policy initiatives without special attention to their impact on the public service media. In virtually every other country, the public institutions are understood as being central to their national media cultures, and they would not be so simply and blithely ignored. The fact that it has occurred this way in the U.S. leads me to Rowland's second law. That is, it suggests something about the extent to which the intent of the government and policymakers over time has been to keep the public media right where they are. Just well enough supported to stay alive, to be a safety valve, if you will, on the criticisms and the problems associated with the commercial enterprise. But never so well supported as to become a competitive threat to the commercial media colossus or the interests of broader political economic power generally. I think it's a really important thing, and again, I've come to the conclusion that this is just, the pattern is too regular. And it's never spoken, it's not talked about openly, but I think it just undergirds much of what's been going on over the last generation or so. Well, let me turn to the fifth point under item B, the difficulties of making the case of the public broadcasting response. I want to begin by suggesting that it is one thing if the policy-making establishment abandons a particular sector. It's quite a different matter if that sector allows itself to be ignored. And that, alas, has been the pattern throughout the many major statutory and regulatory initiatives in these past 40 years. In virtually none of them, save maybe arguably perhaps the spectrum auction proceeding now, have the public media institutions injected themselves into the debate. That is to say, they haven't seen these things coming and then gotten into them and insisted that they be at the table. To be sure, various lobbying efforts have addressed specific technical regulatory issues, but those interventions are for relatively small matters and often after the fact. What we haven't had are any efforts to install public media considerations in the major policy initiatives at their very beginnings in a formative fashion. Now, given the weak funding and resource base for policy development within public broadcasting, this reluctance or inability is not surprising. Most of the available lobbying resources are regularly consumed for defensive measures, most typically the annual efforts to stave off the federal funding cuts that are now such a chronic problem for public media. And I have witnessed this up close, and I see a really hardworking staff at APTS, the lobbying group, very dedicated and so on, but they have trouble keeping their head above water. They're just dealing with a tremendous onslaught of problems and issues, mostly around the funding, year after year after year. And this need has been particularly strong in the past 2 to 3 years. After the 2010 elections, the rise of the Tea Party, and several public missteps by NPR, there were furious efforts to eliminate all federal funding for public broadcasting. And many state governments actually did make major and, in some cases, total cuts in their contributions. It wasn't a problem in Colorado because we never had state funding for public media. But half the states have been providing support over the years, and there were devastating cuts that occurred in these last 3 to 4 years. That they were not all entirely successful is testimony to the hard work of the lobbying efforts by the Washington staffs and among the stations. But that success masks the reality that, again, all that effort diverts public broadcasting from any long-term internal system and related policy planning. And that situation is exacerbated by the structural contradictions we've already discussed. The variety of competing institutional interests throughout the system makes it exceedingly difficult to pull together with a clear common vision and purpose. The national agencies and the stations have no ability to work collectively to do the macro level work. That is, to step back, to consider their overall sets of missions, structures, and challenges with an eye to reform, let alone significant growth and development. It's not as if public broadcasting is totally dysfunctional. Its machinery is able to work on a day-to-day and a year-to-year basis, and it continues to provide a great deal of valuable programming and community service all across the country. But what it cannot do is imagine a much larger and more robust future for itself. It simply is unable to articulate a concise case statement that tells Congress, foundations, and most importantly, the American public, what it would be like, what it would like to do differently and better in the future, and what that cost would be. It is important to understand that the policymaking establishments in this regard is really important, that the policy-making establishments of both major parties really have no interest in or incentive to encourage that sort of planning. Sure, there are relative differences of attitude between the parties. We can just talk about it out loud. Generally, the Democrats are more supportive of the basic system than the Republicans. But even when they've been in the majority, Democrats have not been all that more progressive relative to public broadcasting's long-term funding and system development. As difficult as it is for some partisans to hear, neither the Clinton nor the Obama administrations have made public media a priority. Therefore, it is safe to say that generally, on a bipartisan basis, Congress has kept the system on a short leash and has encouraged it to keep its sights low. This pattern has persisted for so long that the public media themselves have become all too used to their constrained conditions. They are stuck in a posture of what I've come to call my third law, namely a now permanent state of trained incapacity. That is, public broadcasting has been carefully taught to accept the status quo, and it has proven quite difficult to motivate itself into a more ambitious and aggressive stance. So it's gotten very comfortable at just kind of saying, we'll stay where we are, and we better not rock the boat because we might lose even that, even though we keep losing it. Now, I know I've drawn a fairly gloomy picture of the public media situation generally, and I want to be careful to underscore, as I hinted a while ago, the excellent work that is being done throughout the system. So, for instance, one cannot look at the improvements in NPR's news capacity in the past decade without coming to the conclusion that a major shift has occurred in at least one aspect of public media vision. I mean, think about where public radio was 2 decades ago and where it is now in that regard. Meanwhile, the PBS work in science, children's programming, cultural performance, and the Ken Burns history documentaries all continue to be first-rate and a clear sign of what is missing in the commercial world. Weekly local programs such as Colorado Inside Out and Studio 12 at Channel 12 and our American Graduate efforts in partnership with CPB are examples of fine local content offered all across the country. But that said, it's clear that in the face of all the commercial competition and the changing social uses of electronic communications, the public system is in need of overhaul in several important respects. Here then are a few proposals for reform. Most of these are focused on the public television system. Some are drawn from or are amendments from proposals of major foundation study groups, and some even go back to the second Carnegie report. Others come from various elements within public media themselves, and some are just plain mine. So, first one, let's just blow up the national organization and production system and start over. I mean, there is no way that any rational person can review the structural and process issues I've just outlined here this evening and still seriously argue for the status quo. The system is not growing. It is not taking full advantage of its existing local digital platforms. And in many ways, its operations are sclerotic. It's doing a lot of good things, but it just isn't moving out there to embrace this new world. Much as was predicted so long ago by the Second Carnegie Commission and other internal studies at the time, and I was part of some of those, without an overhaul of the national structures and approaches to content, particularly in television, the system will be unable to respond to the opportunities presented by the broadband world, and it will continue to be marginal to the national media culture. So it is long past time to replace the CPV, PBS, and current producing stations arrangement with a more integrated and efficient structure, and in the process build a branded set of multiple national services. Given the existing platforms and digital capacity, there is no reason we cannot have 6 to 10 multicast public television services in every community in this nation. But the current structure of the system and the way it operates will never allow that to happen. And I dare say the funding problems exacerbate that situation. Secondly, let's lay out a wholly new multiple service national programming plan. It's implicit in what I was just saying. The current public television system is capable of producing only a few hours of primetime national programming a week. It generates several more hours of content for other parts of the schedule, but it doesn't even control the rights to most of that material. In short, it's a pitifully small amount of programming by comparison with the large production engines of public service broadcasting abroad and various even smaller cable channels at home. It also has large missing pieces from the array of what a vibrant, variegated, adequately funded American public television service could provide. The system should offer a set of multicast services that do what the cable industry promised 30 years ago to do, but quickly abandoned. Let's have 3 to 4 complementary national services, expanding the PBS brand and establishing a wider, more clearly identified presence on the cable and satellite platforms. Here are just a few examples of how to do that. The NewsHour. It's okay, but let's bring PBS and NPR together to provide a co-produced, multiple platform, 24/7 public news service that brings all of public media to the heart of American journalism, hour in and hour out. You see it beginning to happen in radio. Could happen in television as well. Do it on a joint basis. Let's link that to a much more concerted joint local television, radio, and online news effort that goes far beyond and is much more flexible than the current handful of CPB-sponsored regional local journalism centers. And let's see serious engagement with that project by those major national foundations and media foundations that otherwise are full of critiques about public media, but rather short on grants. Why not work, that's going to really get me in trouble. Why not work with one of the networks, say CBS, to build out a dual public commercial morning television magazine show that allows a Charlie Rose to do all of what he's really capable of. Don't constrain him just within the commercial world. Provided a secondary service where they go long form with him and the team on that show. In partnership with major universities, let's develop a real learning channel, taking the Coursera and TED ideas and putting them on steroids with a national distribution capacity. Why don't we plan on a major 10-year project to commit large segments of the American literary and theatrical canon to video, to update much of what Hollywood has done, but also to dramatize the work of those the commercial world has ignored and to bring other fugitive work to the screen. Let's make a bargain with the American people that for proper funding, we'll provide a permanent, comprehensive national election campaign debate project for federal, state, and local races to serve as an alternative to the highly expensive and corrupting commercial campaign advertising system that we now have.
Here, here.
Let's call it Citizens Reunited. And finally, let's dare to be entertaining and even funny. A sense of humor and high-quality light fare is a staple of every great national public broadcaster abroad, and it pays, as NPR has discovered. Thirdly, let's develop a model for clear, complementary diversity and better collaboration among the stations across the land. Much of the analysis of the public television structure spends too much time and uninformed energy on decrying the existence of multiple stations in many communities. And I just had a little indirect fight with somebody at the FCC about this today. Some reports claim that the station structure is overbuilt and inefficient. And there are periodic calls for reducing the number of station licensees from the current about 180 to 2/3 or 3/4 of those. But those proposals are not at all well researched. Their proponents haven't conducted anything like a basic cost-benefit analysis. They make false comparisons with the structure of commercial television, and they demonstrate little awareness of the situation abroad. They also seriously confuse the opportunities in a situation like Denver, where we have 2 well-differentiated stations, with the conditions in dozens of communities across the country, particularly in the central Midwest, on the 2 coasts and up in the along the Canadian border in the east, where you have overlapping signals of essentially the same PBS content on 2, 3, or even 4 stations. That is to say, there are communities where you can see Nova, Masterpiece, whatever, at the same time on 2 or more stations. That's not what we have here in Denver. And yet it's the Denver kind of situation that gets scapegoated as being the source, apparently, of so much inefficiency and the need to cut costs. So we need, and I should say about that these kind of recommendations have become a convenient way of drawing attention away from the real issues, which are the structural contradictions and I think the inefficiencies at the national level. We never talk about those things. They don't come up. Your meetings hosted by CPB or PBS, guess what? We don't talk about whether or not PBS and CPB ought to be restructured, whether we ought to throw out the current arrangement and redo it. Most seriously, these recommendations are a counsel of despair, seeing progress only in retrenchment and reflecting no vision for what public media could be in this country were it adequately designed, funded, and given positive policy support. What we need instead is a much more visionary approach that, far from apologizing for the existing station base, celebrates it and works to establish a better structure and process for exploiting it. So rather than punishing the Colorado community that created 2 stations in Denver by taking away $500,000 a year of federal funds, which they do, those stations should receive and be rewarded for their differentiation, and there should be a system set up across the land for promoting such diversity in communities all over the country. Fourth, let's develop a major joint federal and private partnership plan to double and then triple the resources for public media over a 5-year period. That is, go back and be ambitious the way the second Carnegie Commission report was. Rather than accept the status quo, which at best is level funding, public broadcasting needs to break out of its trained-in capacity and insist on a much larger resource base and better regulatory policy support for its work. It should seek a four-way partnership with the government, federal and state, the foundations, the corporate world, to build its revenues to a level that is consistent with the programming and service goals outlined above. All of these sectors have been underperforming relative to supporting the system, but none of them have really been put on public notice about it. Nor have they, however, been given good enough reasons for making substantial improvements. And finally then, to do all of this, let's lay out a comprehensive 3 to 5 year plan for the system. We need a much more sophisticated top to bottom, left to right, up and down, every which way planning capacity. If one were to tell public broadcasting today, if I could do this, that we could triple the size of its federal funding pool, believe it or not, the system could not now say what it would do with that increase. Right? He has some ideas, she has some ideas, there's some ideas, but there is no consensus on that. It has no collective national case statement of the kind that would be expected of any major corporate entity, and certainly of the kind any single station itself needs for its own periodic local capital campaigning. Public broadcasting needs to do a much more thorough job of assessing audience interests and needs, scanning the technological and marketplace environments, reviewing its mission and laying out adequately researched, data-based plans for the newer content development and structural arrangements, rearrangements that we've been suggesting here. Right now it has no capacity to do that, and therefore it is mute before its enemies, but more seriously also before those who would like to help it advance. Again, it's pretty good at playing defense, but that's really all it's been doing for the past 3 decades. It is long past time for public broadcasting to go on the offensive and to demonstrate the courage of its convictions. So let me conclude by returning to the beginning. In 1979, the Second Carnegie Commission recognized that public broadcasting was a great yet still underperforming public asset and encouraged the nation to invest much more in what it called a public trust. It recommended that public broadcasting and public authorities work together to redesign the system to reestablish it on a whole new level. In the intervening years, the public has regularly acknowledged the value of the enterprise, and it has accorded it an extraordinarily high degree of such trust. Yet all that faith has not been translated into political action. commensurate with the promise and needs of a truly comprehensive and robust public media system. One of the major reasons for that contradiction, as I've been at pains to outline, has been that public broadcasting itself has remained diffident and uncertain about its own sense of expanded purpose and importance. Despite all its solid work in various dimensions, it has not given the public, the government, or the private sector sufficient evidence of its own certainty about where it wants to go and how it intends to get there. As has been widely observed before, while partnerships in building the public media system are essential, the first step in establishing those relationships and engendering the necessary support must come from within the public broadcasting system itself. No one else is going to take that lead on its behalf. I mean, there's just not going to be a savior third Carnegie Commission that's going to come out of the sky and take care of it. So while it is a great blessing to have such warm public admiration, if public broadcasting is to find its way more directly into the center of American media culture, it must itself do much more to build on the public's trust. So, thanks for the opportunity to share these concerns with you, to think out loud about what I've learned as this ethnographic participant observer in the last few years. I'll look very much forward to your questions and further thoughts about these challenges. Thank you.